Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 25, the concluding part of the video series. In the last 24 weeks, we looked at what are the different aspects of an enterprise architecture practices and defined a six-layer framework, right? So we'll start with a summarization of the six-layer framework and see, basically, I want to recap whatever we looked at in the last 24 weeks to conclude the series. This is the six-layer framework I introduced when we started the series. So there are six layers: the usage, evolution, breadth and depth, architecture, domains, artifacts, and repository. These six layers, basically, each layer plays a role in defining how do we want to practice enterprise architecture, how do we define or establish enterprise architecture practices within the enterprise, right? Let's look at each layer in a brief, but let me summarize what we looked at in each layer in the previous weeks. Right, so usage layer, this is where we're going to define, we are defining who are the stakeholders, how they want to use the enterprise architecture, right? What components they are looking for, what are the viewpoints they have, and how also the behavioral aspects of how we want to go, how do we want to establish the governance practices, what ways we want to discover the components, etc. And the type of components that typically we define as both strategic or change management kind of components, like how do we want to bring in enterprise architecture changes for a project, who are the stakeholders, what viewpoints we want to look at. All these aspects comes in the usage layer. Right? And this becomes a basic requirements of what we want to address in the enterprise architecture. Evolution, next layer is evolution, which basically defines the time sensitiveness of the enterprise architecture components, right? What is the lifespan whenever we define an enterprise architecture component? What is the lifespan of that component, right? How that component is going to evolve? How are we going to define the versioning strategy? How are we going to manage the change management, or manage change management process, right? And also defines how we want to lay out the transition for the enterprise architecture itself, right? So typical components of like roadmaps, transition architectures, blueprints, which blueprints gives a snapshot of at a particular time, right? And standards, what standards we want to adopt to, and how that standards are going to evolve, right? So all those aspects come into the evolution aspect. And like I said, the behavioral components are the versioning and the change management aspects. Moving to the next layer, this is the breadth and depth layer. This layer basically lets us or allows us to define a strategy how we want to break down the enterprise, right? So both horizontally and vertically. So when I say horizontally, basically is breaking down the enterprise into each business units or logical or physical units, which are concerned about a particular aspects of the business or enterprise, right? So this basically helps us to narrow down the scope for each segment so that we can get into more details, right? And then the vertical part of it comes in. We want to define how deep we want to go, right? So it's up to each enterprise to say that I want to break it down this way, and then how deep I want to go in my enterprise architecture definitions, right? And how detailed of enterprise architecture components we want to capture, right? So this basically is the horizontal, breaking down the organization of enterprise into horizontally as well as vertically, right? So typical components here are the segments, right? The breakdown horizontally, the capabilities that are broadly addressed in the segment, vision for each segment, and the principles that govern each segment, right? And the traceability aspect. So our enterprise architecture will be traceable horizontally. So any business service we deliver might impact multiple segments within our business units within the enterprise, right? So we need to be able to connect across the segments horizontally, as well as we should have traceability from top to down, right? Moving down, this is basically a pictorial representation of what an enterprise is. So I picked it up from TOGAF. So we have enterprise, we have vision at the enterprise level, then segment level vision, we break down segment, and each segment have a vision. And then we have the different architectural domain components for at enterprise level and the segment level, right? And then we have the transition architectures, the evolution aspect, right? So this is just two levels, but enterprises can define how they want to break it down, what level of depth they want to go in, right? So this is a typical way of representing the enterprise architecture and scoping down so that each organization or each subunits can focus on their aspects, right? Moving further down, this is the architecture domains layer. This is the core of the enterprise architecture practices, where we define the actual components. So here in this layer, we are going to determine what are the components we want to capture for each of these domains, right? And it's again driven by the top requirements of how we want to use it and who are the stakeholders, etc. Right. So we'll quickly look at what are the different domains, right? This is aligned to TOGAF, but there are differences in the way when we get into the details, we'll see how it's slightly different from how TOGAF defines it versus I look at it, right? So business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture are the four domains. Business architecture deals with the business processes and the services we offer, the entities the or enterprise deals with, and the business functions each actor is going to perform, and the overall customer journeys or the user journeys, right? Information architecture is the information model and the data model. So the logical information model as well as the data model aspects. Application architecture defines the how applications are aligned, right? So the landscape of the application, system flows between the applications, the APIs and interfaces of the applications. The technology architecture is the technology aspect of it. What is the deployment architecture, technology landscape, standards, specifications, all this comes under the technology architecture. So this is a quick view at business architecture. The roles, business services, which is the service that business offers to the external world, right? And the business processes, which basically achieve those business services, combination of business services, business processes we could make a business service. Business service is a process. A business process has intermediate steps, whereas a business function and performed by multiple actors, whereas business function is an atomic function performed by a single actor. And business capability, as I define it, is an abstraction of business function. So we can derive reusability. Business entities are the entities that the enterprise is concerned about. Events, these are the transactional events, the trigger points that could trigger a process, right? And the journey is a complete journey across business process, typically within a business service, how the customer or the user goes through their journeys, right? It could be transactional journey or life cycle journeys, like billing, right? That's a life cycle journey which automatically kicks in, right? Feedback for every process or every transaction, there needs to be a feedback that needs to go to the actor or the initiator of the transaction, right? So that could be an email, SMS, whatever, or on-screen pop-ups or whatever. So that's all the feedback aspects that we need to look at, right? So this is the very high level, the business architecture, the components of the architecture. Now let's look at information architecture, right? Information architecture, primarily I define it into four aspects. IT capabilities, which is the abstraction from the business capabilities or business functions. Business objects, which is again a business entities are what we concern on the business domain, where each business, what entities, processes, or functions work on. Business object is an abstraction of that. And the services could be basically the experience services, which is the UI, UX based services that we offer, and the APIs of it, right? So services could be either offered through a UI tool that user or a customer uses, or an API which system to system interactions is enabled. And also the policy objects, which is primarily the business rules or the policies of the organization that should be handled, behavioral aspects of it, right? Policy objects. So we have structural business object and the policy objects. Coming to application landscape, application architecture, we have the application landscape, the functional, which is basically all the applications within the segment or the enterprise, and the functional architecture of how these applications are connected, the macro level flows, right? And the micro components are the application data model and the application component architecture, right? So what the physical data models or the logical data model and application is going to be very concerned about is in the application data model. And the application component architecture is the breakdown of the application itself. What are the different internal components of the application? Similarly, on a technology architecture perspective, we can capture the technology landscape, which is the overall technology choices within the enterprise or the segment wise. What are the technology choices for what type of tech? applications, right? And the deployment landscape, how we want to, what physical or logical or a cloud or a data center infrastructure we have, and how we are planning to do the deployment across those. Right? Application technology architecture deals with within the 19, so gives the micro level of what technology components are being used, and application deployment architecture is the micro level of how application is going to be deployed, right? What redundancy we are going to bring in, how fault tolerance or load balancing is applied, etc. Right? Comes into that. So that covers the architecture domains layer, right? And then comes to artifacts. So we defined what are in the architecture domain layer, we defined what are the different components we want to capture in each domains. And here in the artifacts layer, we will define what artifacts are we going to use to represent those components, right? So let's go to the next slide. So this is the typical type of artifacts. So it could be catalog. So catalog meaning catalog of items along with the definitions, right? So components could be captured as a catalog. Components could be captured as a matrix, which basically is a mapping between multiple components, right? The relationship between the components. The model, which is the static part of it. So it could be a data model, it could be an application model, right? Meaning component can capture application component architecture, all the functional architecture of all the overall landscape. So all those comes into the model. And the flow is either the control flow or the information flow that we want to depict, right? How applications going to talk to each other, or components going to talk to each other, how the information is going to flow, or the control is going to flow, right? So typically, I define mark the artifacts into these 4 buckets: catalog, matrices, models, or flows, right? And flows could be sequence diagram, it could be sequence diagram, interaction diagram, those are the flows. Models is our entity models, right? Object models, class diagrams, etc. Matrix are simple mappings, and catalog is the definition as well as the catalog of items. Moving to the last layer, this is a repository layer, which basically whatever requirements we captured in all the higher layers, we're going to implement through the repository, right? This is the actual tooling, right? Which basically includes the software, the storage, everything, right? And how we're going to gather data for KPIs, all the integrations with the enterprise system, right? It can integrate with the project management system, etc. All those aspects comes in. And typically, there are tools available in the market that can be used as a repository, right? So, or it can be homegrown, but typically we go with some tooling that we can use, right? It could be any tool. There are a bunch of tools in the market. So the repository layer is the actual implementation of all the requirements that we captured in the previous layers. So this completed the 6 layers, and then we looked at spent some time on the architecture styles and patterns. So architecture styles are broad approach that serves as a reference, or the reference for architectural decisions, right? So it's a broad pattern or broad style we have to follow, for not related to a particular problem statement, right? Architecture patterns are solutions for a particular problem statement, while architecture styles are broad approach we want to follow, right? It could be enterprise level or it could be a sector level. Right? Broad, and it is primarily to establish or implement a vision or establish an architecture principle. Right? So it aligns to the vision and the architecture principles. Whereas architecture patterns are simple solutions to the patterns, reusable solutions for specific problem statements. It could be at a macro level or macro level problem statements or a micro level problem statement. And over a period of, so once we establish a common pattern, common solution for a problem statement, that could be applied over and over, and it basically drives the development of frameworks and tooling in the market. Right? So this next slide, I just want to represent how this ecosystem, what I define as an ecosystem for the enterprise architecture practices, architecture patterns, right? How industry uses the pattern, right, for the benefit of the enterprise as well as the industry, right? So typically an enterprise defines a problem statement that could have commonality with the industry specific problem statement, right? Common industry problem statement. So we can align to the particular problem statement. That helps us look for standard architecture patterns that industry or other enterprises has implemented for that problem statement. So we can pick an architecture pattern to solve that problem. then we can look at saying that, oh, there are for that patterns, there are open source frameworks or tools, commercial tools in the market that implements those patterns. So we can pick those framework or the tool for the enterprise users. And then the continuous improvements comes in, right? So that framework or a tool can be extended for the purpose of the enterprise, because that problem statement could be slightly different. So we can extend that. So when we extend that, enterprise can contribute back to the industry for continuous improvement of the framework. So and the tooling improves, right? So that's a typical ecosystem that exists today and that's continue to exist. So that both enterprise and the industry benefits from each other towards enterprise architecture, right? So that concludes or that's a summarization of what we have looked at in the last 24 weeks or so, right? So that concludes the series on the enterprise architecture. Thanks for watching. Thank you.